The key idea of our method is to leverage out-of-the-shelf keypoint detector in order to condition a NeRF so that we can instantly create volumetric avatars of humans that can be rendered from novel views.
Welcome to Talking Papers, the podcast where we talk about papers and let the papers do the talking. We host early career academics and PhD students to share their cutting-edge research in computer vision, machine learning, and everything in between. I'm your host, Itzik Ben Shabbat, a researcher and knowledge disseminator. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to Talking Papers, the podcast where we talk about papers and let the papers do the talking. Today, we will be talking about the paper KeypointNeRF, Generalizing Image-Based Volumetric Avatars Using Relative Spatial Encoding of Keypoints, published in ECCV 2022. I am happy to host the first author of the paper, Marko Mihajlovic. Hello, Marko, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Itzik. Happy to be here, and thank you so much for the invite.
Can you introduce yourself?
I'm a second-year PhD student in computer vision at ETH Zurich, where I'm supervised with Professor Siyu Tang, and my research is mostly focused on photorealistic reconstruction of static and dynamic scenes, but also modeling of parametric human bodies that are more efficient for interactions with 3D environments.
And who are the co-authors of the paper?
This project was mostly done during my internship at Meta Reality Labs, where I collaborated with three amazing researchers, Aayush, Bansal, Michael Zollhoefer, and Shunsuke Saito, and of course my supervisor from ETH, Siyu Tang.
Okay, so let's start. In a TLDR kind of format, 2-3 sentences, what is this paper about?
On the very high level, KeypointNeRF is a generalizable NeRF for virtual avatars that leverages key points for the high-fidelity reconstruction of humans from very sparse observations. So given as input 2 or 3 images, KeypointNeRF generates volumetric radiance representation that can be rendered from novel views.
Cool. So you basically take very few images and you create a volumetric avatar.
Right. You can imagine you take a few selfies of yourself and you instantly get the avatar of yourself that can be rendered from novel views.
Okay, so let's dive into the introduction. What problem exactly is this paper addressing?
So in this paper, we try to address two main problems. The first one is to enable fast reconstruction of human avatars. So as I mentioned, given very sparse input views, we want to create high-fidelity human. And another goal is to propose a universal reconstruction framework that can be directly applied to all sorts of articulated objects. For example, you can use our algorithm for the reconstruction of human faces, human bodies, plants, animals, etc., without any algorithmic modification. And this is different compared to prior work that mostly incorporates a category-specific parametric model.
Okay, so you basically answered the question, why is it an important problem? But why do we need virtual avatars? Where can we use this?
This is quite important concept in academia, but also in industry, for example, for virtual telepresence or for digitization of humans, social media, etc.
Okay, and what are the main challenges in this domain?
There are several challenges. The first one is the reconstruction from very sparse observations. As we know, NeRF would not work on very sparse inputs. And another issue is generalization to unseen subject. So there is lots of different hairstyles, facial expressions, etc. And maybe the last challenge is generalization to novel capture studios. So, for example, if you train a model into the nice studio, then it's probably not going to generalize to some in the wild capture images.
Wow, interesting. You got me excited. But before we dive in deep, just in a few bullet points, what are the main contributions of this particular work?
Yeah, so the main contribution of this paper is a way of conditioning NeRF on detected key points. And another contribution is a generalizable pipeline that generalizes to unseen identities, like unseen subjects, but also novel capture systems. And we also perform an extensive analysis of different types of spatial encodings to better understand how to encode key points and condition the NeRF properly.
Okay, so this all sounds super interesting, but just before we dive into the bits and bolts of exactly how you did it, let's talk a little bit about related work. So If anyone wants to read your paper and understand it, what 2-3 papers do they have to read first?
The first one, for sure, is NeRF. It is such a simple and amazing concept. So NeRF represents a scene via an MLP and takes as input a query point and a viewing direction. And what you get as output is volume density and view-dependent emitted radiance field. This allows you then to render novel views by leveraging classic volume rendering. But one of the issues of NeRF is that it requires expensive per-scene training, and another issue is it does not work well for very sparse input views. Which brings me to the second line of work that try to tackle this limitation. So approaches from last CVPR, like pixel NeRF, PVA, and IBRNet, leverage pixel-aligned features to condition the NeRF and get nice reconstruction from very sparse observations. So for this project is more relevant IBRNet, which uses a very nice trick of leveraging IBR, like image-based rendering, to parameterize the color prediction by blending the corresponding input pixels. And what this allows you is actually to have a very nice generalization at inference time, even to the colors that are not observed during the training. And another side benefit is that you can use it directly for high resolution input images without extra computational costs. And the third most inspiring paper for this project is PIFU, Pixel Aligned Implicit Functions, which is a reconstruction method for humans. So it takes as input one image or multiple images of a human and models the human geometry by using an implicit network.
Okay, so let's dive into the approach now. But before we do, let's give the general pipeline. So what's the input? What's the output? Maybe talk a little bit about the NeRF, how that fits in.
So on the very high level, the input to our system is a set of RGB images with their camera parameters. And the output is the volumetric representation of a human that can be rendered from novel views by leveraging the classic volume rendering techniques from NeRF.
When you say classic volumetric rendering and volumetric representation, what exactly do you mean? So what is the values at the output?
So to render a pixel from a novel view, what we do is that we shoot array and then we sample query points. For each query point, we can translate it into volume density and view-dependent color information. And then simply by accumulating the color and density along the array, we can get the pixel value, which represents this volumetric rendering on a very high level.
Right. So during training, your input is a set of images and their camera parameters, right? Where the camera is positioned in space. And the output is this volumetric representation that now during inference, you can set your camera basically wherever you want. You cast a ray and you know to say what's the density and what's the color at each point along that ray. And that way you can render this new novel view image.
Yeah, exactly. So the main difference compared to this NeRF framework is that we have now two parts. So one part is these convolutional encoders, where we take the input images and then we encode them via convolutional encoders into feature maps. And another part is NeRF style MLP that is going to predict view-dependent color information and volume density. Now, in addition to these two components, we also leverage out-of-the-shelf keypoint detector, where we detect for human face like landmarks, and then we uplift them in 3D by using the standard triangulation method. Now, the encoding of the human is these feature maps that we get from the convolutional encoders and also 3D key points.
So for every image that you get as input, right, you extract key points. So points along the
Correct.
face for human faces. And you also extract these kind of traditional feature maps, right? So you run a convolution on the image and then you get these different feature maps. Now, what do you do with these two?
Now, when we want to render a new image, we shoot array, we sample points on the array, like in a NeRF. And then for each query point, we extract feature And this feature is composed of a key point feature and a convolutional feature. The convolutional feature is obtained by projecting the query point onto the image planes and then bilinearly interpolating the feature maps. And I'll come back later to this key point feature. And now when we have this feature that is pixel aligned, we translate it into volume density and view-dependent color by leveraging NeRF style MLP. But the difference is that we borrow this rendering head from IBM, where we parameterize the color prediction as blending of input pixels. This allows us to generalize nicely to unseen colors at inference time, and also to use very high resolution images without extra computational costs.
Yeah. Can you elaborate a little bit more about the key point feature?
So these pixel align features are great, but they're just floating somewhere in space. So we need a spatial anchor for these features such that the neural network can learn a consistent prior. So for this case, we leverage key points. Given like a query point and these key points, we project all of them onto the image plane and compute depth of key points and the query point. And then we calculate the reprojection depth between the query point and key points. This relative difference goes through positional encoding that is proposed in NeRF, and then we weight it according to the Euclidean distance. Now, this is our relative spatial encoding that comes from the key points. And the key insight is that this enables you to learn nicely local features. So if you have human face, then the key point will tell you, okay, now this is the information only about the eye, and you should learn it consistently across the subjects. Now you have information about the nose, and then you learn it across different subjects, which is the key for robustness to novel capture systems.
So to put it in a little bit different words, the way I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, basically you have your key points all around, let's say, the face, right? You have the eyebrows, the points around the mouth, all of those key points around the face. And then when you cast a ray, you basically take the key point features and you kind of weigh them based on their distance to that ray, right? That point along the ray. So the closer they are to the ray, the more influential these features are. And that allows you to now, instead of learn this general pixel level representation, now it's more of a anchor level features, right?
Exactly.
All right, go on. So you have your key point features now?
And now when we render this novel pixel, we can just supervise it by using the standard pixel level loss. In particular case, we use L1 reprojection distance, but also VGG loss to get more high frequency details.
Okay, so only these two components in the loss, and you train it for...
Yeah, I think 150,000 iterations. It's similar to NeRF, maybe 2 days of training. And then we have this generalizable representation that can be used for novel subjects.
So basically you train on a set of people, right? Where you have a very small set of images, right? This is one of the nice things about this paper, that you don't need so many views, right? You can give very good results with only two. At least that's what I saw in the paper. And then you train it on a set of people, and now you can generate new images for a new set of unseen people, human.
Yes, exactly. So for the human subjects, we train on around 350 subjects, and then we generalize to novel subjects. But for human body, we use even less. Like we train it only on 7 subjects, and then it already generalizes to unseen ones.
This is a great build-up to move on to the results section of the paper. So how do you even evaluate this kind of result?
We follow the standard evaluation procedure from NeRF, and then we simply compute PSNR and SSIM between rendered view and ground truth view.
For the novice listener who doesn't know what's PSNR and SSIM, can you maybe a little bit explain what does this measure? So what are these evaluation metrics and what do they quantify?
So on the high level, you can consider that PSNR measures only the pixel-wise error, whereas SSIM samples a small patch and then compares the patch, which includes some structural information. So we have pixel-wise loss and this more structured loss term.
So what experiments did you do?
So the first part of experiments was we trained the method on the studio capture data, 350 subjects, and then we generalized to unseen ones, and then we compare it to the standard baselines that are out there, like IBRNet, pixel volumetric avatars, MVS NeRF, etc. And then, of course, we show good results.
Otherwise, the paper wouldn't have been accepted, right? You have to have the bold numbers.
yeah, exactly. But we also compare different types of encodings. Instead of conditioning on key points, the prior work, PVA, uses the canonical pose of the human as an encoding. And we show that this localized encoding is much more powerful. And we also measure the robustness of perturbing this canonical pose of the human or perturbing key points. And our representation is also more robust with respect to the noisy key point estimation. And another very cool experiment that we performed is that we trained it on this studio capture data, and then we can just use it for the in the wild capture images. So if you take a few selfies of yourself, we can directly apply our method and get decent NeRF level reconstruction.
In which cases does your method fail?
So if you go very far from the input views, then of course it can fail. Since it does not hallucinate unobserved parts, it mostly just does reconstruction. So maybe a potential future direction would be to leverage GANs to infill these missing parts.
So when you say, let's say you have an image from the front of the face and then from one side, if you go all the way to the back of the head or something like that, it has never seen before, it's going to fail, right?
Yeah, of course, it's going to fail. That's why leveraging some generative method could help to improve in these kind of cases for more extreme viewpoints.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? It can make up stuff that it had never seen before, right?
Right, exactly.
If these kind of views existed in the training, so if you had, for example, these kind of, let's say you had more than 2 views, you had 3 that cover basically everything, would it make it better?
Maybe slightly better, but still it could not hallucinate something that is not visible from the images, simply because we parameterize the color prediction as the blending of input pixels, in the IBRNet style.
Yeah, and also there are a lot of regions where there aren't any key points, right? The key points focus on very specific targets.
Right. That could be another limitation. So now we have a better reconstruction quality where key points are present, for example, for eyes, nose, mouth. But for hair, there is no key points. And then it performs slightly worse on those regions.
Any unexpected results that you encountered during your experiments?
Initially, we had some unexpected results where we did not train the network properly. So when the novel view approaches one of the input views, so what would the network learn to do is just cheat and copy one of the input views onto the novel view. And this looked super awkward in the videos, in the renderings. But simply clipping the influence of each factor, the influence of each dot product between the ray and the viewing direction to 0.8 fixed all of the issues.
Oh, okay. That's a neat trick that everybody that tries to train this kind of thing should know, right? Whenever you get close to one of the input views, clip it. Otherwise, it won't work. Never
allow the maximum weight for one of the input views.
So can you elaborate a bit about the human body experiment?
So for the human body experiment, we simply train our method on the GU mockup dataset, where we take 7 subjects as training subjects, and then we show the generalization performance on 3 unseen identities. And it's very interesting that our method achieves results comparable to state-of-the-art that leverages these parametric human body models and temporal feature aggregation, whereas we just use these sparse input views for the reconstruction.
Right. This is very cool. So this method can work for both just faces and humans. Everything that you can extract a key point for, this can work for.
Yeah, exactly. It would be very interesting to try it on animals.
Oh, Wow. Yeah. Okay. Moving on to the conclusions and future work section. So how do you see the impact of the paper going forward? And has there been any interesting papers since? So it's very new. Like the paper just came out as we're recording this, but maybe are there any follow-up projects out there?
Well, yeah, it's very hard to predict the impact at this stage, but so far no follow-ups. So I think that the paper proposes some interesting and intuitive formulation of conditioning NeRF, but there are clearly some limitations that can be addressed in the future work. Now there is this recent trend of fast NeRFs, like Insta10GP, so addressing the rendering speed by leveraging one of the fast NeRFs could be interesting follow-up.
When I was reading the paper, I couldn't help but thinking, well, there is this part of the method that does the keypoint extraction. And I was wondering, well, maybe you could also train something that learns which keypoints are the important ones, right? Because right now you're basically using an off-the-shelf kind of thing. Maybe an interesting future project would be, well, how do we learn good keypoints? Because all of these keypoint methods, they're like, oh, okay, let's put keypoints where we think is important. But in real life, we don't know, like it could learn some other keypoints. Do you think that's an interesting direction for future work?
Right, that's definitely an interesting direction. But also there is some papers that propose to learn this triangulation uplifting. So maybe incorporating even that would be an interesting extension.
Yeah, very interesting. So before we wrap up, let's go to my favorite part of the podcast. What did reviewer 2 say? So please share some insight that you got from the review process, maybe the ranks if you feel comfortable to, whatever the reviewers said that made the paper better.
Yeah, all the reviewers were quite positive about the work and they provided quite nice feedback that improved the paper. So before the review, our scores were like 4, 4, 3, and they requested some additional experiments, as always. So pretty much about the questioning about the robustness for different camera calibrations, for the interval captures, or showing results on the dynamic sequence, updating different types of feature encoders. Thankfully, to these insights, we provided those additional results, which improved the paper quality. Yeah, and after the rebuttal, I think the final scores were like 4, 4, 5. So it was accept and 2-week accepts.
Sounds really good. Yeah, and I think, you know, the whole review process, like all the time we get this, we want more experiments, but in practice, it's just, you know, you probably initially you already made the point that the claims that you made in the paper are good. They just want, you know, to make sure a few things, see that you've done some very relevant, interesting ablations. And I think in the wild example is very, like, it's a valid question, right? When I read those kind of NeRF papers, it's always, well, wait, how sensitive it is to maybe getting a little bit the camera parameters wrong, or maybe having some noise somewhere that can mess everything up. And yeah, you incorporate everything into the paper, and that made it all that much better.
Yeah, it definitely makes the paper more complete.
Okay. That's it for this episode of Talking Papers. Thank you, Marko, for being a part of the podcast. And until next time, let your papers do the talking. Thank you for listening. That's it for this episode of Talking Papers. Please subscribe to the podcast feed on your favorite podcast app. All links are available in this episode description and on the Talking Papers website. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, sponsor it, or just share your thoughts with us, feel free to email talking.papers.podcast@gmail.com. Be sure to tune in every week for the latest episodes. And until then, let your papers do the talking.